The notice was taped to my front door with enough force to dimple the wood. I know this because I was standing in my garage at 7:43 on a Tuesday morning, eating a bowl of cornflakes that had already surrendered to the milk, staring at the dimple, when I should have been thinking about the Monza aerodynamic load calculations sitting on my desk inside. I worked in motorsport engineering. I'd spent the last 11 years designing surface coatings and track infrastructure for racing circuits. My driveway was, by any reasonable standard, the most structurally sound piece of residential asphalt in the Cedarwood Estates subdivision, possibly in the county, definitely in the cul-de-sac. The notice didn't care about any of that. HOA violation notice, case number 2024 CR 117. Property, 14 Thornfield Close, Cedarwood Estates, owner, James Calloway. Violation, Section 7, and Paragraph 4 of the Cedarwood Estates Community Standards Declaration, nature of violation. Driveway surface and markings are aesthetically inconsistent with community standards. Color variation and surface markings are non-compliant. Immediate remediation required within 30 days, or fines will be assessed at $150 per day. Issued by Brenda Hollis, HOA President. I read it twice. Then I went inside, poured the cereal down the sink, and opened a beer. It was 7:44 in the morning. Some situations require adjusting the timeline. I should explain the driveway. The previous owners had laid down standard residential asphalt. That asphalt had, over 20 years, developed what professionals in the field call reflective cracking. Surface fractures that follow the seams of the base layer below. Most homeowners patch it with cold fill compound from a hardware store, which looks exactly as dignified as it sounds. I'd resurfaced the whole thing myself 2 summers ago, using a polymer-modified bituminous compound that I happened to have access to through work. Same material used on pit lane access roads at sanctioned FIA circuits. Applied it with a squeegee roller, let it cure over a weekend. Smooth, black, impeccable. Then, because I had leftover thermoplastic road marking paint from a circuit boundary project, I'd added 2 things. A center line down the middle of the driveway, and the numbers 1 and 4 at the top near the garage, my house number, done in the same high-contrast font used on Formula One pit boxes. It looked like the entrance to something that meant business. I thought it was clean, professional. My neighbor Dave thought it was the coolest driveway on the street, which he told me while leaning on his fence with a coffee mug, nodding slowly like a man appreciating a fine painting. Brenda Hollis, apparently, thought otherwise. I knew Brenda by reputation before I knew her by sight. The neighborhood had a way of transmitting information about her, the way old buildings transmit damp. Slowly, thoroughly, and in every direction at once. She'd been HOA president for 4 years. She'd filed 37 formal violation notices in that time. She'd successfully lobbied the board to ban non-neutral earth tone exterior paint colors, which had resulted in the Nguyens 3 doors down being forced to repaint their house from a cheerful sage green to what the approved palette called warm oatmeal. The Nguyens called it something else. I'd heard it through the fence. I met Brenda in person for the first time on the Thursday after the notice, when she rang my doorbell at 6:15 in the evening. I opened the door eating a handful of pretzels directly from the bag, which I think set a tone she didn't appreciate. She was somewhere in her late 50s, though she carried herself with the rigid formality of a woman who considered age an administrative failing. Her hair was done in tight blonde curls that sat against her scalp like a row of aggressive pink-beige grenades. She wore a pale blue blazer over a floral blouse, the kind of outfit that communicates I am taking this seriously without specifying what this is. She had a clipboard. Of course she had a clipboard. "Mr. Calloway," she said. Not a question, an indictment. "Brenda," I said. I offered her a pretzel. She did not take it. "I'm here regarding your violation notice, Case 2024, CR 117. She glanced down at the clipboard, though she clearly didn't need to. Your driveway markings. The board has reviewed and confirmed the finding. I read the notice, I said. The center line and the numerical markings are non-compliant with Section 7, Paragraph 4b, which states that driveways must maintain an appearance consistent with residential use and community aesthetic standards. She said aesthetic standards, the way a judge says, and furthermore. The markings are my house number, I said, required by Section 12 of the County Addressing Code, and the center line is a standard safety demarcation. Something moved across her face. A flicker, like a cloud crossing a sun that didn't particularly want to be crossed. The style of the markings, mister, and Callaway is the issue. They are industrial in character. I work in surface engineering for motorsport infrastructure, I said. The driveway is structurally superior to anything else on this street. That, she said, is not what the community standards measure. And there it was. The verbal tick that I would, in the coming weeks, come to recognize as Brenda's signature. Any time she was done with a subject, done with your argument, done with the possibility that you might have a point, she said, "That is not what we measure here." She said it the way other people said, "Case closed," the way a magistrate drops a gavel. It was reflexive. It was her. I told her I'd review the relevant sections and respond in writing. She nodded, made a note on the clipboard, and left. I watched her walk to her car, a pearl-white Lexus SUV with a custom vanity plate that read CDRUD1. Wemwine, because Brenda Hollis was president of Cedarwood Estates in the same way that certain people are president of things, which is to say constantly and at volume. I finished my pretzels. I went inside and pulled up the Cedarwood Estates Community Standards Declaration, all 63 pages of it, and started reading. I responded in writing, as promised. I cited Section 12.3 of the Millbrook County Addressing Ordinance, which requires residential properties to display their address number in characters no less than 3 inches in height and in a color contrasting with the background surface. My numbers were 14 inches tall and white on black. Compliant. I cited the absence of any specific prohibition on thermoplastic road marking materials in Section 7. I cited the fact that a center line, per the HOA's own landscaping guidance in Section 11, could be interpreted as a defined pathway feature. I was polite, I was thorough. I cited 12 separate provisions. Brenda responded 11 days later with a letter so crisp it might have been ironed. The board had reviewed my response. The board found it unpersuasive. The style of markings remained inconsistent with community aesthetic standards. The 30-day remediation window was still in effect. And at the bottom, a note in Brenda's hand. The board appreciates your thoroughness. But thoroughness is not what we measure here. I poured myself a bourbon. It was a weekday, it was fine, and stared at the letter for a while. Then I looked out the window at my driveway. Then I thought about what I did for a living. Sometimes a problem is actually just an opportunity that hasn't been framed correctly yet. I called Marco the next morning. Marco Reyes had been laying asphalt and painting surfaces for 22 years. He was built like a fire hydrant, low, wide, and absolutely immovable, with paint-stained forearms and a gold tooth that caught the light when he grinned, which was mostly when someone was about to be inconvenienced. He'd done contract work for 3 of the circuits I'd consulted on. He answered on the second ring. "James, what did you break?" "Nothing," I said. "I need a surface consultation, personal project." "Personal?" He said it the way you say, "sure," when you mean, "I don't believe you." "I have a driveway situation." A pause. Then the grin came through the phone. I could hear it. "Tell me about this driveway situation." I told him about the driveway situation. There was a silence on the other end, when I finished that I recognized as Marco doing mental arithmetic about what was possible versus what was advisable. With Marco, possible always won. "You know," he said, "I've been wanting to try some of the new high-build epoxy compound on a smaller surface. See how she handles residential grade base." "I was thinking the same thing," I said. "And the grid lines. You'd want proper FIA spec grid box dimensions." Section 3.4 of the FIA Technical Regulations, 5 meters by 2.5 meters per box. "I can do that." Another pause. "This going to upset someone?" "Almost certainly." "Good." He hung up. Here's what I knew about the law, specifically about HOA law in this state, specifically about the Cedarwood Estates Community Standards Declaration, because I had now read it 4 times and highlighted 17 passages. Section 7, paragraph 4, B, prohibited driveways from being aesthetically inconsistent with community standards. But Section 7, paragraph 4, A, the paragraph directly above it, which Brenda had very carefully not mentioned, established that community standards were defined as standards consistent with the residential character of Cedarwood Estates as a single-family home community. Here's the critical part. The declaration had been filed with Millbrook County in 1987. At that time, it had been registered as a private covenant running with the land under the county's General Covenant Registration Act. Under Section 45(c) of that act, privately registered covenants were required to be reviewed and re-ratified every 15 years to remain fully enforceable as style restrictions. They could still be enforced as structural restrictions. You couldn't build a factory, for instance, but purely aesthetic provisions that hadn't been re-ratified were, legally speaking, advisory at best and unenforceable at worst. The Cedarwood Estates Declaration had last been re-ratified in 1994. That was 30 years ago. There had been no subsequent re-ratification on file with the county clerk. I knew this because I'd driven to the county records office on a Tuesday afternoon, paid $4 for a document search, and spent 40 minutes with a very helpful clerk named Patricia, who had the energy of a woman who had seen everything and was delighted to see something new. "So the aesthetic restrictions," I said carefully. "The ones that govern things like driveway appearance and color choices?" Patricia looked at the filing date. She looked at the re-ratification column. She looked at me over her reading glasses. "Honey," she said, "these are about as enforceable as a strongly worded letter." I thanked Patricia. I drove home. I called Marco. "Green light," I said. "What's the canvas?" he said. "Standard 2-car driveway, about 48 feet long, 20 feet wide." He was quiet for a moment, doing the math. "That's almost exactly the width of a pit lane access road." "I know," I said, "but I'm getting ahead of myself, because before I called Marco with the green light, there was the board meeting, and before I could understand why the board meeting changed everything, you need to understand what happened on a Thursday evening in the Cedarwood Estates community room, which smelled of folding tables and stale ambition. I attended. I sat in the 3rd row with a bottle of water and a legal pad. There were maybe 20 residents there, plus the 5 board members in a row of chairs at the front, and Brenda at a podium that was slightly too tall for her, so she stood with her chin lifted at an angle that made her look perpetually offended by the ceiling. I'd requested time under the agenda item, Open Resident Forum, to address my violation. Brenda acknowledged it. Gave me 3 minutes. I stood up. I laid out my legal research calmly and precisely. I cited the 1987 filing date. I cited the 15-year re-ratification requirement. I cited Section 45(c). I explained that a purely aesthetic enforcement action against a compliant structural surface under a covenant instrument that had not been re-ratified was unlikely to survive a legal challenge. I kept my voice level. I looked at each board member once and Brenda twice. I sat down. There was a silence. The good kind. The kind that means something landed. Then Brenda said, "The board will take that under advisement." She looked at her clipboard. And then, and this is the moment I mean when I said she had an unguarded moment, she looked up and said, "What I will say, Mr. Calloway, is that some of us have worked very hard to make Cedarwood Estates the kind of community that attracts a certain type of resident. A driveway that looks like a racetrack is not what we had in mind." She said it like a woman stating a fact. Like the closing argument was obvious. A certain type of resident. She held my gaze for exactly 1 second too long. A second in which she seemed to calculate that I understood what she meant, and that her calculation was correct, and that she was unbothered by it. I understood what she meant. The calculation was correct. I was unbothered, too, in the specific way that a person is unbothered when they have just received full moral permission to do whatever they were already going to do. I wrote on my legal pad, "Proceed." Then I wrote, "Go bigger." The plan, at its core, was simple. The HOA's aesthetic restriction was legally unenforceable. I could resurface my driveway however I chose, subject only to county regulations. County regulations required address markings, set standards for surface materials, and said nothing at all, about racing liveries. What I was going to do was have my driveway painted as a proper FIA-compliant race circuit, starting grid. Full race grid layout, starting position boxes, pole position marker, safety car line, pit lane markings. All done in professional thermoplastic road marking paint, the same product used on actual Formula One circuits, installed by a professional surface contractor, Marco, who had done exactly this kind of work on actual racing venues. But Marco had a suggestion that I hadn't anticipated. "My cousin," he said one afternoon when he was in my garage measuring the driveway with a long tape. Tabre, a pencil behind his ear and a takeaway coffee in one hand. "Is crew chief for a junior Formula circuit team. They do promotional stuff, appearances. Painting driveways isn't in the contract, but painting driveways as a promotional event with full team branding and media presence definitely is." I looked at him. "What are you suggesting?" He grinned. The gold tooth caught the October light. "I'm suggesting your driveway gets painted by a motorsport team, in their team colors. With their branded equipment, in front of cameras." He drank his coffee. "You want to know what that looks like on a Tuesday morning in a residential neighborhood?" I thought about Brenda's pearl white Lexus, about her clipboard, about a certain type of resident. "Yes," I said. "I want to know exactly what that looks like." His cousin's name was Dario Reyes. Different Marco, same Reyes, long story. And he ran the promotional operations for Apex Circuit Racing, an Anglo-Italian junior open-wheel team that competed in the European Formula Regional Series and had recently signed a sponsorship deal with an energy drink company that required them to generate lifestyle content in unexpected residential settings. I know this because Dario emailed me a 2-page brief that used the phrase synergistic brand activation 4 times without apparent shame. I signed a location release. They signed a location use agreement. I got a copy of their public liability insurance certificate, which covered up to £2 million in third-party property damage. I did not tell Brenda any of this. This is important. I told no one in Cedarwood Estates anything. Not Dave next door. Not the Nguyens. Not anyone. The only communication from me to the HOA during this period was a brief certified letter stating that I had reviewed their position and would be addressing the driveway within the violation period. Which was true. In the week before the event, Marco came by twice to do preparatory work, cleaning the surface, applying an epoxy primer coat, laying out the grid geometry with chalk lines that he taped over with brown paper, so the full design would only be revealed during the final paint application. The brown paper looked strange. My driveway looked like it was being packaged for shipping. Dave leaned over the fence on day 2 of the brown paper, a mug of coffee in hand, squinting. "What are you doing to your driveway, James?" "Resurfacing," I said. He stared at the brown paper for a while. "It looks like you're wrapping a present." "In a manner of speaking," I said. He went back inside, satisfied in the way that people who trust you are satisfied with partial answers. The morning of the event was a Friday, 7:15 a.m. I was in the kitchen eating toast. Actual toast, not cereal, I'd learned, when the first van arrived. White Transit, Apex Circuit Racing logo on the side in red and silver, followed by a second van and a flatbed trailer carrying what appeared to be an industrial thermoplastic application cart, the kind that runs on propane and applies road markings at professional highway spec. Behind the flatbed came a small BMW that parked at the curb and disgorged Dario, who was built like Marco but taller, wearing a team polo shirt and carrying a tablet, and the confident energy of a man who had activated synergistic brand opportunities before. I shook his hand at the door. He looked at the brown paper on my driveway. He grinned exactly like Marco. It was clearly genetic. "This is going to be good," he said. The crew, 4 of them in team kit, began removing the brown paper at 7:35. They worked quickly and precisely, the way people do when they've done a job 100 times and know exactly what it looks like when it's done. The chalk lines Marco had laid out earlier were revealed, a perfect starting grid with 2 columns of boxes running the length of the driveway. The pole position box at the top near the garage, the safety car line marked at the base where the driveway met the sidewalk. The thermoplastic cart fired up at 7:42. It sounds like a large, purposeful piece of equipment, because it is. It sounds like something that is doing a job that matters. In a quiet residential cul-de-sac on a Friday morning, it sounds like the opening bars of something that cannot be unheard. I was on my porch with my toast and a coffee, watching when Dave's back door opened and Dave appeared with a travel mug and a folding camping chair, which he set up beside his fence and sat in with the calm deliberateness of a man who has correctly identified that something worth watching is happening. "Morning, Dave," I said. "Morning," he said. He nodded at the cart. "That a road marking rig?" "Yes." He considered this. "For your driveway?" "Yes." He opened his travel mug and drank. "Okay," he said. The grid markings went down at 7:55. The thermoplastic compound goes on hot, around 180 degrees Celsius, and sets within 90 seconds on a prepared surface. It has a texture. It has a presence. It catches the light at the same angle that tells your eyes. This is a professional surface. The crew worked from the bottom of the driveway upward, laying the grid boxes 2 at a time, the position numbers in regulation font stenciled in white. They applied the safety car line in green, the pole position indicator in yellow, the red and silver Apex Circuit Racing Team livery, chevrons in the team colors, was applied along both edges of the driveway like the barrier artwork on a pit lane wall. By 8:30, it was done. My driveway was, objectively and without exaggeration, a Formula One starting grid, rendered in professional materials by a professional team, featuring a junior motorsport team's official branding, installed to FIA specification. It was magnificent. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. The Apex crew took photographs. Dario shot video for the team's social media. I stood at the garage end, at pole position, drinking my second coffee, and looked down the length of it. "Beautiful," Marco said, from somewhere to my left. He'd shown up at 8:15. Uninvited, in his own truck, just to watch. He had his arms folded and the expression of a craftsman admiring a finished job. "Yeah," I said. Dave, from his lawn chair, started applauding. He slow-clapped for approximately 10 seconds. Nobody had asked him to. He just did it. One of the Apex crew looked over, confused, then started clapping too, then another. And for a brief and genuinely absurd moment there was a round of applause on a residential street at 8:31 on a Friday morning for a driveway. I took a very small bow. I couldn't help it. The certified letter to the HOA went out that afternoon by priority mail and email, with photographs attached. I wrote it very carefully. Dear Miss Hollis and members of the board, please be advised that the driveway at 14 Thornfield Close has been remediated in response to violation notice case number 2024 CR 117. The driveway surface has been resurfaced using polymer-modified thermoplastic road marking compound, a professional-grade material exceeding any residential driveway specification in the community. The resurfacing was performed by a licensed and fully insured surface contractor. The address markings, house numbers 1 and 4, remain in place per Millbrook County Addressing Ordinance Section 12.3 and are embedded within the new surface design. The design reflects the professional background of the property owner in motorsport surface infrastructure and is consistent with the surface's structural specifications. I would draw the board's attention to my previous legal analysis regarding the enforceability of purely aesthetic restrictions under the 1987 Declaration, which has not been re-ratified per the requirements of the General Covenant Registration Act, Section 45C. Should the board pursue further enforcement action on aesthetic grounds, I am prepared to challenge that action in county court and to make the full legal analysis available to any interested resident. I have enclosed photographs for the board's records. Regards, James Calloway, 14. Thornfield Close. The photographs were very good. The Apex team's photographer had done a proper job. There was an aerial shot from a drone. Dario had a drone. Of course he did. That showed the full starting grid from above. The red and silver livery vivid against the black surface. The position numbers crisp and white. It looked from above exactly like the grid at a small but serious circuit. I pressed send on the email. I cracked open a beer. It was 3:15 in the afternoon. Under the circumstances, entirely appropriate. The reply from Brenda came at 11:47 p.m. that same night, which told me everything I needed to know about how the photographs had landed. Mr. Calloway, the board has reviewed your so-called remediation with considerable concern. The installation of what appears to be racing circuit markings and corporate team livery on your residential driveway represents a severe escalation of the aesthetic inconsistency originally noted. This is manifestly not a residential appearance. The board is convening an emergency session Saturday at 10 a.m., and your presence is requested. Furthermore, the board disputes your legal analysis and is consulting with the HOA's legal representative. Brenda Hollis, President, Cedarwood Estates, HOA. I read it twice. I noted the time, 11:47 p.m. I noted the word considerable. I noted that she had not disputed a single specific legal point, which meant the HOA's legal representative had either not yet been consulted or had already delivered news that Brenda was not ready to put in writing. I replied at 7:15 a.m. the next morning. 3 sentences. Dear Miss Hollis, I will attend Saturday's meeting. I look forward to the discussion. Please ensure the board's legal representative has reviewed Section 45C of the General Covenant Registration Act before the meeting. Regards, to James Calloway. The Apex Circuit. Racing social media posts went live Friday evening. Dario had tagged the location as Cedarwood Estates Pit Lane and captioned the drone photograph, "Sometimes the best racing surfaces aren't at the circuit." By Saturday morning, the post had been shared 1,100 times, and a racing-themed lifestyle account with 90,000 followers had reposted it with the caption, "This man said HOA take that." There were comments from people in 7 countries. One person said it was the greatest residential driveway they'd ever seen. Several people said they wanted to move to my street. I saw the Nguyens look at their phones on their front porch Saturday morning, and then look at my driveway, and then look at each other with the expression of people recalibrating their sense of what was possible in this neighborhood. The board meeting was at 10 a.m. I arrived at 9:55 in a clean shirt. Not dressed up, just clean. Dave had offered to come, which I'd politely declined. I needed a board meeting, not an audience, and Dave has a talent for turning things into audiences. The community room had 11 residents in it, which was more than triple the usual turnout, and suggested that information about the meeting had traveled through the neighborhood with characteristic efficiency. Some of them had clearly seen the social media post. There was a particular quality of attention in the room that I recognized as people who have arrived hoping for something. Brenda was already at the podium. Her curls were tighter than usual, which I was coming to understand as a stress indicator. She had her clipboard. She also had, seated beside the board table, a man in a gray suit who I correctly identified as the HOA's legal representative, a Mr. Dennis Farwell, this Yumtons, whose expression was that of a man who has looked at something and found it significantly worse than expected. Brenda called the meeting to order. She laid out the board's position. The new driveway markings were a commercial-style installation inconsistent with residential community character, and the board intended to enforce Section 7, Paragraph 4, B, and assess daily fines beginning immediately. She turned to Mr. Farwell. "Dennis, please advise the board on enforcement options." "Mr." and Farwell cleared his throat. He looked at his notepad. He said with the measured tone of a lawyer delivering news he was not enjoying, "The board's enforcement position has some challenges." Brenda looked at him. "Challenges. The resident's analysis of Section 45C is not incorrect." He paused. "The aesthetic restriction provisions of the Declaration, as registered in 1987 and last re-ratified in 1994, are not presently in a state that would allow for confident enforcement in county court. A challenge would likely succeed. The structural provisions remain enforceable, but those relate to safety hazards and illegal structures, not surface markings." Silence. Brenda said, "That is—" "Additionally," Mr. Farwell said gently, "the way you continue talking when you know the other person wants you to stop. The surface materials used appear to meet or exceed county code requirements. The address markings are compliant with the county addressing ordinance. And the installation was performed by a licensed contractor with appropriate insurance." He closed his notepad. "I would advise the board against pursuing enforcement action." Brenda did not say anything for approximately 4 seconds. I counted. Then she said very quietly, "That is not what we measure here." And something in the room shifted, because she'd said it to a lawyer in a gray suit who was not measuring anything except legal exposure. Tato. And the phrase hung there in the community room air and meant absolutely nothing, and I think on some level she heard it that way too. She turned to address the room. And this is where it went, as Marco would say, to 11. "What I will say to this community," Brenda said, and her voice had the strained brightness of someone who is not going to be moved by lawyers or legal provisions or 30-year filing deadlines, is that this board has spent 4 years building something here. Building standards, building a community where people can be proud of their street, where property values reflect the investment people have made. She was gripping the podium now. The clipboard was on the table. And one resident decides that his personal hobby, his little motorsport thing, gives him the right to turn his property into some kind of theme park exhibit. A certain type of resident understands that living in a community means considering your neighbors. That is what we measure here. She looked at me. Not everyone agrees that a racetrack driveway is what Cedarwood Estates should be. I said calmly, "Do your neighbors agree?" I didn't mean it as a trick. I meant it as a genuine question. But the room answered it before Brenda could, which is not something I'd planned for. One of the residents, Mrs. Chen, who lived 4 houses down and had served on the original HOA board 12 years ago before resigning over what she called an atmosphere of pettiness, raised her hand and said, "I'd like to see the driveway before I have an opinion." Someone else said, "I saw it on Instagram this morning. It looks incredible." A third voice, a younger man I didn't recognize, maybe a recent move-in, said, "My wife wants to know if the HOA can fine us for adding color to our fence, because we've been afraid to ask." And then the meeting became something I had not planned for and could not have staged, which was 11 residents asking Brenda Hollis a series of increasingly pointed questions about past violation notices, paint color restrictions, and the general authority of a 1987 declaration that had not been re-ratified in 30 years, while Mr. Farwell sat very quietly and looked at his notepad and said nothing at all. Brenda lost the thread of the meeting around minute 20. I watched it happen in real time. She kept going to the clipboard and then putting it down. She answered 2 questions about the Nguyen's paint situation with a curt, "That was a separate matter," that satisfied no one. She said, "That is not what we measure here," twice more. And the second time, a woman in the back row visibly suppressed a laugh, not well enough, and Brenda heard it. I don't know if what happened next was something that had been building for 4 years, or if it was specifically the suppressed laugh that did it. All I know is that Brenda Hollis, HOA president of Cedarwood Estates, put both hands on the podium, drew herself up to her full height, which was modest, and said, "This community will not be turned into a joke by one man's midlife crisis." The room went completely quiet. "My driveway," I said in the flattest tone I had, "was painted by a professional racing team to FIA specification, using materials that exceed any residential standard in this county. It has been featured in international press. It has generated more positive attention for Cedarwood Estates in 48 hours than the HOA has in 4 years." I paused. "I don't know what a midlife crisis looks like, Brenda." "Chun, but I'm fairly sure it doesn't come with a drone photograph." Brenda Hollis did something then that I will never be able to fully describe, only approximate. She opened her mouth to respond. She closed it. She looked at her clipboard. She looked at Mr. Farwell, who was studying his notepad with profound interest. She looked at the 11 residents who were all, in one way or another, looking at her with an expression that could not be confused for support. She picked up the clipboard. She set it down. She picked it up again. Then she said, "This meeting is adjourned," in a voice approximately 2 registers higher than her normal speaking voice, and walked, not stormed, walked, because she was Brenda and Brenda did not storm, to the door. And as she went through it, the clipboard caught the door frame at an angle and was knocked cleanly from her hand, and it hit the community room floor with a crack that echoed off the linoleum and scattered several papers across the tiles. Tafua, and she did not stop to pick it up. She just kept walking. The door closed. Mr. Farwell stood, collected his things, nodded briefly at no one in particular, and left. Mrs. Chen picked up the scattered papers from the floor, stacked them neatly, and set them on the table. "Well," she said to the room, "I'm going to go look at this driveway." 6 people went with her. Dave was still in his lawn chair when they arrived. He'd brought a thermos and a newspaper. He looked up at the small procession with no apparent surprise. "Told you," he said, to no one in particular. "Greatest driveway on the street." Mrs. Chen stood at the foot of my driveway, at the safety car line, technically, and looked up the length of it. The October sun was hitting the thermoplastic at a low angle, and the red and silver livery was glowing slightly, the way road markings glow in good light. The position numbers were crisp. The pole position box at the top caught the sun. "It's actually quite beautiful," she said. "That's the high-build epoxy base," I said. "Holds the color." She looked at me. There was something in her expression that wasn't quite amusement and wasn't quite respect, and was probably both. "You know," she said, "I looked at the HOA finances last year. She's been spending discretionary funds on community standards materials. I never knew what that meant. Clipboards, I said. Probably clipboards. Mrs. Chen smiled. The Nguyens, who had appeared at their front door to watch the procession, were now standing on their porch looking at the driveway. One of them, I couldn't tell which, I'd only spoken to them twice, raised a hand in something that was either a wave or a salute. I raised mine back. The HOA did not pursue further enforcement action. Mr. Farwell sent a letter to all board members 3 days later that apparently made quite clear the legal landscape, because Brenda did not call another emergency session. By drawings, she did not send another violation notice. She did send one more email to me, 11 days after the meeting, which read in its entirety, Mr. Calloway, the board notes your compliance with the driveway remediation requirement. Brenda Hollis. President. I read it once. I didn't reply. That was 3 months ago. The driveway is still perfect. Thermoplastic road marking compound is rated for 15 years of standard vehicle traffic, and I don't drive heavily. The Apex team's social post eventually reached something north of 40,000 shares, which Dario told me with a level of enthusiasm that suggested his energy drink sponsor was very pleased. Marco came by once just to stand on the pole position box and photograph it on his phone, which he then set as his screen wallpaper. Dave has started introducing the driveway to new people who come to his house. He says, "Have you seen my neighbor's driveway?" in the tone of a man asking if you've seen the Sistine Chapel. The Nguyens quietly repainted their fence last month. Sage green. Nobody filed a violation notice. I was in my garage on a Thursday evening last week, a beer in hand, looking at the grid from the top, from pole position, as it were, when I noticed something. The HOA had posted a new notice on the community board outside the amenity center, a call for nominations for board positions. 2 seats up. I looked at the notice for a while. I took a long drink of beer. I went inside and found the 63-page declaration and opened a fresh document on my laptop. The driveway looked after itself. Some battles, though, are better fought from the inside.